He shouted, "You shall live and not die," and then collapsed on the spot. Another pastor said, "I'm ready to meet my maker," and seconds later, he did. These aren't stories from a movie, they're real. This is 10 black pastors who died live on stage, and each one left behind a stunned congregation. From heart attacks mid-sermon to final words that turned prophetic, we're counting down the most unbelievable final moments ever captured in church. 1. We will begin with Pedro Henrique.
Palavras que a gente vai falando, vai repetindo. Nem sabe o que é. Falou Bolsonaro.
The lights were shining bright in Feira de Santana, Bahia, and a congregation filled with hundreds of people was dancing to the rhythm of Vai Ser Tão Lindo. Pedro Henrique was at the mic, so it was no wonder the crowd was filled with the Spirit. The young vocalist even invited the crowd to join him, and all their voices echoed in the night air. But then the worst happened. Mid-verse, Pedro lost balance. He fell backwards and landed on his back in front of the band. Everyone screamed and scrambled in shock. What was meant to be a sacred night immediately turned into a dark and horrible one, a night that has haunted many to date. The day was December 13th, 2023, a day the entire congregation would never forget. And even if they wanted to, the video clips from that moment still exist to remind them. Pedro stumbled and fell, and his bandmates rushed to help. He was carried backstage, then rushed to a local medical clinic. But minutes later, doctors confirmed he'd suffered a massive heart attack and was dead. He was just 30. Pedro Henrique launched a solo career under Toda Music and released hit singles like Nunca Falou, Tua Voz, and Vai Ser Tão Lindo. With over 1.1 million followers on Instagram, it was obvious that many loved his voice and his message of hope. But on that fateful day in 2013, all his fans were thrown into mourning. Pedro's label, Toda Music, shared their grief with an Instagram post. They called him a happy young man, a husband, and super dedicated father. They also pledged all their support to his grieving family. Brazilian gospel artists Fernanda Brum and André Valadão also shared how sad they were at the news. Everyone else across Brazilian Christian platforms was left in shock. Pedro is survived by his wife, Suilan Barreto, and their daughter Zoe, who was just 2 months old. She was a child old enough to remember nothing, left with a wife suddenly bereft of her partner. Toda Music organized digital tributes in his name, and artists like Gabriel Henrique and Davi Saquer dedicated performances in his honor. Some ceremonies honored him at award shows, and he even received posthumous recognitions at the 2024 Melhores do Ano, where he won Cover of the Year and was nominated Cantor do Ano, too. But the next story would fill you with even more chills. Reverend Dr. Jerome McNeil,
but I'm saying right now, if you've been going through the same cycle, nothing's changing.
Senior pastor of Dallas's Christian Chapel Temple of Faith, was wrapping up one final sermon when, without warning, his voice faded away and he collapsed. Before he slumped, he was delivering a sermon of hope. It was July 15th, 2012, and it was during the mid-morning worship. Reverend Dr. Jerome McNeil had walked down the aisle like he always does. As he preached, he stepped away from the pulpit and made his way down the center aisle. Suddenly, everyone heard a thud. The preacher had fallen.
If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 99% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. Thank you so much. Now back to the video.
Ministers raced forward, and Dr. McNeil was immediately rushed to the hospital. But seconds later, he was declared dead. For 21 years, McNeil shepherded what began as a small chapel into Dallas's Temple of Faith. He did it so well that membership grew to over 7,000, making it one of the largest in the Christian Methodist Episcopal denomination. Though exact medical reports were private, sources suggested that he had suffered a sudden cardiac arrest, common in middle-aged adults under physical strain. The news of his death spread swiftly. Local media displayed memorial posts from grieving members and ministers, with many calling him a mentor, friend, and father figure. McNeil's wife of 39 years, Billy, and daughters Charla and Vanita had no time to prepare. One moment, their husband and father was hale and hearty. The next, their rock was gone. They grieved terribly. In February 2013, Dallas County renamed a wing of the Juvenile Justice Center to Jerome McNeil Jr. Juvenile Detention Center. They did that to honor his involvement in reform and youth mentorship. Christian Chapel's 150th anniversary, held later that year, also paid homage to McNeil's leadership. When McNeil preached his final sermon, He had no idea it would be his last, but it was. He died doing the work he loved. 3. Next is one of the most ironic deaths in this list. Bishop Barnett K.
Your mother's prayer, your father's prayer.
It was a happy Sunday at New Jerusalem Church of God in Christ in Virginia Beach, but that happiness was about to float off in a whiff of smoke. Bishop Barnett K. Thorogood, known for his thunderous baritone, was delivering a sermon titled, "I Am Here to Do Battle," before the unexpected happened. There were more than 2,000 people in the congregation when he declared, "You shall live and not die," and everyone in the hall had shouted in response. But a few seconds later, just after that declaration, the worst happened. He died. Bishop Barnett K. was a phenomenal preacher who preached to prisoners at age 5. Years later, he founded New Jerusalem in the early 1970s with just 2 members. Before long, the ministry became a cornerstone of SeaTac and beyond. After 4 decades, the church grew to over 2,000 members. He even preached to superstars like Pharrell Williams, Timbaland, Missy Elliott, etc. The morning he died, his energy was at an all-time high as always, and his congregation was in high spirits. When he screamed, "You shall live and not die," everyone was excited. Well, after screaming, he sat and simply passed quietly. He didn't collapse dramatically, he just closed his eyes and gave up. By the time his condition was noticed, it was too late. Sources confirmed that Barnett Thorogood had a history of cardiovascular disease, so it was concluded that he suffered a sudden heart attack, likely tied to underlying congestive heart failure. Paramedics were called, but their efforts couldn't reverse the moment. He had already left his earthly body by the time they reached him. Timbaland's mother had been present at that Sunday service, so the artist tweeted, "Rest in peace to my pastor, a true angel, Bishop Barnett K. Thorogood." The news was also shared by many others, including Justin Bieber. Public figures attended Bishop Thorogood's funeral, including Virginia Beach officials and state leaders. His wife, Ernestine, of 39 years, and his children, Bertram, Emmanuel, Jonathan, and Micaiah Bonita, mourned heavily. They mourned their husband and father, who had led missions, supported orphans, and partnered with Timbaland to feed communities in SeaTac. Of course, they also mourned a devoted father and spiritual anchor. Barnett Thorogood died fulfilling his deepest calling, preaching. His church lives on, his family carries the name forward, and though he is gone, the echo of "You shall live and not die" still resonates from New Jerusalem to beyond. 4. But even that is not as tragic as what happened to Reverend Kenneth Green, Sr. It was May 3, 2015, and the congregation at Greater St. Mary Baptist Church in Algiers, New Orleans, was filled to the brim. Reverend Kenneth Green, Sr. was on a pulpit delivering a sermon excitedly. At the peak of his message, he paused, wiped sweat from his brow, and quietly said, "If the Lord called me now, I'm ready to go." What do you think happened next? Well, moments later, his eyes rolled and he collapsed. Everyone screamed and tried to rouse him immediately. They also called paramedics, and many held their breath as they tried to revive him. But Green had already passed. Kenneth Green served as senior pastor of Greater St. Mary Baptist Church for 8 years before his death. In that time, he led programs for the homeless, offered hospital fees to those ill, and preached from many pulpits. A church member, Joan Martin, shared how he even buried her sons and prayed with her through her grief. At age 56, Green was described by everyone as kind, healthy-looking, and deeply invested in people, so they were shocked at the news of his death. According to the congregation, he had no known chronic condition. Well, medical responders and news reports hinted at a sudden cardiac event. He leaves behind a grieving wife, Ava Mallory Green, and 3 beloved children, Brittany, Kenneth Jr., and Jalea, who were thrown into the deepest pain. WDSU News also called it a deep wound for Algiers churchgoers. The church mourned publicly. His family drew strength from the core values he preached about. Reverend Kenneth Green was a man who declared readiness to die, then quietly died. The phrase, "If the Lord called me now, I'm ready to go," would forever haunt his family because he really lived up to his own words. 5. But what happened to Reverend Jack Arnold?
To my cell, That night on my knees, I said, Lord,
Reverend Jack Arnold was 69 years old when he was finishing his message on heaven. He even quoted John Wesley, who said, "As long as God has work for me to do, I am immortal. But when my work for Christ is done, I go to be with Jesus." Minutes after quoting John, he gripped the podium and dropped heavily to the floor. It was the most shocking scene, and many in the congregation were scarred forever. They described the moment as surreal, saying it was as though the pastor had stopped existing mid-sentence. Newswires carried the story, and the Associated Press statement became among the most read religious news items of 2005. The coincidence of quoting Wesley immediately before jerking upright and closing his eyes shocked the whole community. Associate Pastor Michael Beat, the man who relayed the account, later described what followed. Those in the congregation with medical training had rushed forward, but Arnold appeared to have died instantly. His death seemed to be from a sudden cardiac arrest. In fact, he had undergone bypass surgery about 5 years earlier. The team with him that day also recognized signs of cardiovascular strain. His son, Dean Arnold, who lived in Chattanooga, flew immediately to Orlando. Arnold's wife mourned too, and the church, Covenant Presbyterian, was shaken. His congregation would later remember him for his gentle leadership and calm teaching. Jack Arnold served for years as senior minister at Covenant Presbyterian Church until the late 1990s. After stepping down, he founded Equipping Pastors International, a ministry that taught pastors in Africa and the Middle East. He traveled across continents, India, Indonesia, Korea, and Mexico to train people and build relationships that endured even after his death. Reverend Jack Arnold had preached about heaven, and in the very moment he spoke about it, he entered it. His collapse may have startled the crowd, but many learned a lot from his final moments. Work until your work is done, then go. 6. During a scorching Sunday morning in Kuruman, Northern Cape, at the sanctuary of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, 42-year-old Reverend Bassie Jackals, known for his passion for the Bible, was exhorting his congregation when he suddenly sat on a chair to catch his breath. The crowd applauded, assuming it was part of the performance, but the applause soon ceased and everyone began to scream. What happened? He had slumped. Instantly, the church scattered. Some rushed to help him, and others tried to call for help. But when he arrived at Kuruman Hospital, Jackals was pronounced dead. At age 42, Jackals served as a presiding elder within the AME Church. His colleagues described him as selfless, approachable, and as a support in moments of crisis. Once, he had even traveled from Klerksdorp just to comfort a pastor recovering from a car accident. His aunt called him dependable, and a chaplain at the local municipality said that he often opened council meetings in prayer and actively encouraged unity in the congregation. The moment was so tragic. A video clip exposed the moment he sat down before falling forward. It was a tragic clip that showed how the place of worship could be transformed into a place of panic in seconds. Unfortunately, the video circulated online, and shock flooded social media. A post-mortem later revealed that he died from hypertension and diabetes, conditions he had been managing quietly. Church and civic leaders offered their condolences to the church and family, and the Northern Cape provincial government extended formal sympathies. Some fellow pastors even saw his passing as a cautionary tale. One of such was Zambian pastor Walter Mwambazi, who called his death a wake-up call. He saw it as an urgent reminder for ministers to rest, delegate, and build support structures for families. He also begged for apostles to be supported long-term, not just spiritually, but materially. Jackals is survived by his wife, Puleng Christina Jackals, and 4 daughters who were deeply shaken by their loss, especially with all the videos circulating online. Everyone gathered in Warrenton for his burial, and he was mourned by everyone who loved him. 7. Next is Deacon Francis Oluwole Ogunusi, a respected elder and community leader of Onikoko in Nigeria, who died while delivering a sermon about death in his native language, Yoruba. He was speaking against Nigeria's rise in ritual killings and the lust for illicit riches when his tragic death occurred. According to Daily Trust, a local news outlet, he was said to have said, "The money you make through unlawful means, killing people, sucking human blood. When death comes, it will belong to another person." But while his interpreter was rendering his message into English, unexpectedly, Ogunusi slumped. At first, The microphone fell from his hands. Then he fell too. Chaos erupted. Many ran away, and some began to pray. Security officials and congregants immediately rushed to carry him out. Some eyewitnesses said he fell before reaching the ground. But whatever the case, he was taken to the Federal Medical Center in Idi Aba, Abeokuta, where he was pronounced dead. What could have caused his death? According to another pastor, Pastor Ogundia, just 3 days earlier, they had gone for medical checkups together, including cardio. Ogunusi had even purchased drugs. The pastor also said his friend always exercised daily, but that didn't stop nature from taking its course. Many church leaders claimed his death was spiritual, not medical, that God had summoned him. Ogunusi was not the pastor at Ekwa Onikoko, but he was a community voice. As Bale of Onikoko, he was deeply respected and trusted. The pastor at Ekwa, Pastor Elisha Ogundia, said Ogunusi had been assigned sermons twice a year because everyone loved his presence. His wife, Abidemi, still in shock, described him as open-minded, humble, generous, and selfless. She also mentioned that his death was shocking as he had shown no visible signs of illness. According to her, he was healthy and agile. And true to her words, that morning, he had preached with vigor. Before the worst happened, she wept and prayed with other pastors at the hospital, but it was a communal trauma too. His warning about death echoed deeper after his fall. Later, church leaders gathered, shared the grace, and worship ended abruptly. That Sunday, Ogunusi had warned the congregation of death, the death that visits those who profit through unlawful ways. He spoke of mortal accountability in Yoruba, then slipped from life before the words could be translated. Even in death, he spoke the truth and was never afraid. 8. The next pastor passed on a warm Tuesday evening. 65-year-old evangelist Norris Nyakudanga was at the Chisipidi United Methodist Church in Harare. He was the guest speaker at the end-of-year revival, and he was a good one. In just minutes, he had energized the congregation with praise songs and danced too. Then he began his sermon. In his sermon, he warned against negativity in the messages of pastors. He warned that some church messages were not uplifting, but roughly 5 minutes into his speech, it happened. Eyewitnesses say he swayed and leaned on the lectern before collapsing so heavily that the pulpit shook. The crowd scattered. Nurses in the congregation rushed to check his pulse and lift his head. But seconds later, Evangelist Nyakudanga drew his last breath and was gone. The revival night turned into a night of mourning. Evangelist Norest Nyakudanga was known affectionately as Baba Norest. He served more than 4 decades as a lay evangelist of the United Methodist Church in Zimbabwe. Locals remembered him as humble, dedicated, and hardworking. According to eyewitnesses, Nyakudanga had looked robust and even cheerful, but mid-sermon, he gripped the pulpit and collapsed. All efforts to revive him failed. The news traveled fast. The Seke South Circuit, a cluster of UMC congregations, posted on Facebook, "Treasured evangelist Baba Norest Nyakudanga is no longer with us. He collapsed while preaching and later died at a local hospital." Editorial tributes in the Herald called him a leader who was loved in church circles. He was deeply mourned by everyone in his community. Among mourners was his niece, Praise Dekateki, who described him as both a family priest and provider, who provided for her and his family. Nyakudanga is also survived by his wife, Taurai Chinyani, and their 3 daughters, Masvita, Nomusa, and Nyaradzo. He also has 9 surviving siblings. At his rural home in Mutoko, his family and the wider community prepared a burial in his honor. The church also bestowed on him a posthumous honorary ordination declared by Bishop Aben K. Niwatiwa. At the burial in Mutoko, the family stayed awake all night and observed his memorial. Norest Nyakudanga's caution against divisiveness became his legacy. Now, even in his absence, his voice echoes through many sermons and revival banners. Unfortunately, the cause of his death was never revealed. 9. But everyone knew the cause of Bishop Curvy Brown, also known as Curvy Brown, a celebrated gospel singer and pastor who collapsed and died while preaching live during a service in Danville, Virginia in July 2024 at Greater Deliverance Temple in Danville. He had been singing a heartfelt song when he suddenly collapsed. It was an event many wished they had never witnessed. Bishop Brown was only 65 when he died. News reports confirmed he died of a massive heart attack, and that confirmation broke many. He had more than 40 years of musical and ministerial influence. He was a preacher, teacher, singer, and pastoral guide. Members of the crowd were left in shock. Many broke into tears, and others knelt in silent prayer. Local news eulogized him not just as an artist, but as a civic servant. His death made national headlines in religious media. He might have died of a heart attack, but his heart continues to beat through music, ministry, and the memory of many whose faith he shaped. Number 10 is Outro, Dr. V. Raymond Edmonds' death. On Friday morning, September 22, 1967, at a routine chapel session in Edmond Chapel at Wheaton College, 67-year-old Dr. V. Raymond Edmond was carried in a chair onto the stage. He had recently been recovering from a heart attack, and doctors had forbidden him from stair climbing. That morning, Dr. Edmond's sermon to the chapel filled with over 2,400 students was, "In the presence of the King." While speaking, he described meeting Emperor Haile Selassie, and the church was silent as they listened. Then, around 10:53 a.m., as his sermon came to an end, it happened. Dr. V. Raymond Edmond suddenly raised a hand to his chest and dropped to the floor. Everyone screamed, but it was too late. He had just suffered a massive coronary attack. Journalists later described the scene as sad and solemn. Students were trembling, and some even cried. Among them was John Piper, who was a sophomore at the time. According to him, the chapel bells rang 67 times, once for each year of Edmond's life. Their beloved pastor had suffered a heart attack the previous winter, an attack so bad that he had to endure limited mobility. So his final death was caused by a massive coronary failure. V. Raymond Edmond had served as Wheaton's 4th president from 1941 to 1965, and then as chancellor until his passing. Under his watch, enrollment increased by 50%. A dozen new buildings went up, endowments rose, and a chapel named in his honor opened in 1960. He mentored Billy Graham, who would later call him the most unforgettable Christian I ever met. Students and faculty were in total shock as they had loved him. Normal schedules on the campus were stopped. Many had memorized his aphorisms, "Don't doubt in the dark what God has told you in the light," or "Not somehow but triumphantly." 2 days later, Billy Graham delivered Edmond's memorial sermon on campus. He preached that there was a time for all things, a time to be born, and a time to die. Wheaton renamed the building Edmond Memorial Chapel, and his funeral service was attended by family, faculty, staff, and student representatives. Shortly after, the family burial happened at Wheaton Cemetery. Edmond married Edith Marie Olson in 1923 in Ecuador. They had 4 sons: Charles Raymond, Victor Rowland, David Arthur, and Norman Elner. Their loss was deep, but they were comforted with decades of shared spiritual messages. Now we have to ask, do faith leaders ever find the time to care for their health? Tell us what you think below. Meanwhile, now that you know how these pastors passed on, how about you check our next video on the 15 times black pastors were destroyed on live TV to discover another secret?